Right now at 5, a major change in strategy from the commander-in-chief. President Obama announced today American troops will stay in Afghanistan longer than his original deadline. The president's plan calls for the 9,800 U.S. troops to stay in Afghanistan through most of next year. 5,500 will remain there when he leaves office in 2017. The American military mission there was due to end next year.
And John McCain and President Obama appear to have found some common ground. The Arizona senator says he's pleased to hear that the president has decided to keep more troops in Afghanistan. His remarks came after President Obama announced 5,500 U.S. troops would remain in Afghanistan when he leaves office in 2017. But Carly Fiorina has a different view. The Republican presidential candidate says the president has simply recognized reality by delaying a planned drawdown of U.S. forces. She has long accused the president of not listening to military advice in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Fiorina was in Iowa for a campaign event.
He now is recognizing that Afghanistan is becoming potentially a haven for ISIS, and that the Taliban is not on the wane, as he has tried to convince the American people of for years.
But Fiorina appeared to level criticism at former President Bush, too, saying the nation-building effort in Afghanistan has been, quote, foolish and naive.
And joining us to discuss today's announcement is NBC 10 military analyst Colonel Rick Kiernan. Colonel Kiernan's military resume includes 26 years of Army experience. He served our country in Germany, Vietnam, and Saudi Arabia. He was also presented with 2 Bronze Stars. So thank you for being with us, Colonel. Quite a reversal of the president's previous position, where he was withdrawing troops from Afghanistan. What kind of message does this send to the American people who thought the conflict there was winding down?
Well, I think we have 2 things to consider. Number one, we've been there more than a decade. And I think when you look at the situation, several years ago, it was more force on force. We now have a different type of enemy, which is the counterterrorism and the insidious presence of ISIS. So when the enemy changes its presence, we have to adjust to that also. And it's not necessarily a larger number of troops against a larger number of troops. So I think this adjustment in strategy is probably going to be appropriate for the type of enemy that we're facing right now.
Colonel, we're hearing a lot about ISIS these days. It seems every other day they're in the headlines. How will this decision affect the fight against that terror group, if it does?
I believe it does, because part of this smaller number of troops also includes a train and advise role. So even though we have a smaller number of troops, it's not dissimilar from many years ago when we had advisors at the end of the Vietnam conflict. So it's a combination of coordination and cooperation with the Afghan government. In the last decade, they've had a change in their government. There's been a change in the nature of the mission because of the enemy's change. So I think you adjust your strategy and modify it to fit the current situation. And a smaller force, which has had advisors and is really adapt to working with the local Afghans, is very appropriate now for the size force that we have and the nature of counter-terrorist versus a number of large substantive troops.
And up to this point, the presidential campaign hasn't touched much on Afghanistan. We know that could likely change now. NBC 10 military analyst Colonel Rick Kiernan, thank you.
Thank you.
And coverage of today's announcement from the president continues on NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt. That's ahead, of course, at 6:30 tonight.